In the spring of 2012, a research team from the University of Montana attached GPS collars to a group of mule deer wintering along the edge of a small mountain town in the Bitterroot Valley. The study was designed to track seasonal migration patterns, the kind of broad-scale movement data that wildlife managers use to make decisions about road placement, hunting seasons, and land use planning. The researchers expected to document the deer moving out of the valley as snowpack receded and pushing into higher elevation summer range along routes that had been used by mule deer in that drainage for generations. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. What they documented instead was something the study design had not anticipated, and that the principal investigators spent the better part of 2 years trying to explain convincingly to a peer review community that was skeptical about what the data appeared to show. The deer were using roads, not crossing roads in the incidental way that deer cross roads all the time, as obstacles between where they are and where they are going. They were traveling along roads, moving parallel to the asphalt surface, using the road corridor itself as a preferred route of travel during specific behavioral contexts. They were entering residential yards in the subdivisions that bordered their winter range and moving through those yards with a purposefulness that looked, on the GPS track record, less like opportunistic foraging and more like deliberate navigation. They were using the infrastructure of human occupation, the roads, the yards, the fences, the lights, the landscaping, the noise, as something other than what wildlife biologists had traditionally assumed it was, which was a hazard to be avoided, a cost in the deer's movement budget, a source of stress and disruption that the deer tolerated because the habitat on the other side was worth it. What the Bitterroot data suggested, and what subsequent research conducted across multiple sites in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana, has since confirmed with enough methodological rigor to move from suggestion to documented phenomenon, is that Rocky Mountain mule deer are doing something that requires a fundamental reassessment of how wildlife biologists think about the relationship between prey animals and human infrastructure. They are not merely tolerating roads, yards, and human corridors as necessary evils in a landscape that has been degraded by development. Under specific conditions, in response to specific pressures, they are actively selecting them. They are choosing to move through human-dominated terrain, past people and vehicles and artificial light and noise, in a way that appears to confer a specific and measurable survival benefit. The benefit is not food. It is not cover in the traditional sense. It is not access to water or mineral resources or any of the standard explanatory categories that wildlife biologists reach for when trying to account for unexpected habitat selection behavior. The benefit is protection from mountain lions. If you find the evidence in this kind of research as compelling as I do, subscribe now so you never miss a piece of work like this. What follows is a deep examination of what researchers have found, why it matters, and what it tells us about the intelligence, adaptability, and strategic capacity of an animal that most people drive past on mountain highways without giving a second thought. The mule deer of the Rocky Mountain West are not a species that has been underestimated in the scientific literature because researchers ignored them. They have been underestimated because the framework through which wildlife biologists traditionally study prey animal behavior was built around a set of assumptions about how prey animals perceive and respond to risk that turned out to be incomplete. The classical model of prey behavior treats the prey animal as an agent, trying to maximize caloric gain while minimizing predation risk. The animal selects habitat that provides food and cover. It avoids habitat that exposes it to predators. It makes these trade-offs in ways that can be modeled mathematically using landscape variables like vegetation density, terrain ruggedness, proximity to water, and prey biomass. For decades, the implicit assumption embedded in this modeling framework was that human infrastructure, roads, buildings, residential areas, represented a category of habitat that prey animals would treat as a negative in their landscape assessment, something to minimize exposure to in the same way they minimize exposure to predators. The deer would use human-adjacent terrain if the food was there or if the migration route required it. But they would not select it preferentially. They would not choose it as a strategic refuge. The data from the Bitterroot study, and from the much larger and more systematic body of research that it eventually helped catalyze, showed that this assumption was wrong. Not wrong in all cases, not wrong for all individuals, in all seasons, but wrong enough, and wrong in a systematic enough direction, that the classical model of prey habitat selection in human-modified landscapes needed to be substantially revised. The revision that the evidence points toward is one that takes seriously something that appears, on the surface, almost paradoxical. Mule deer in the Rocky Mountain West have learned, at least in some populations, to use the human presence itself as a predator deterrent. They have figured out, through some combination of individual learning and possibly cultural transmission within social groups, that mountain lions avoid the areas where humans are most active, and that by placing themselves in those areas during the periods when predation risk is highest, they can reduce the probability of being killed. This is not a small behavioral adjustment. It represents a sophisticated and flexible response to a predator-prey landscape that has been fundamentally altered by human occupation. And it raises questions about mule deer cognition, about the speed at which behavioral adaptations can spread through wild populations, and about the long-term ecological consequences of prey animals restructuring their use of the landscape in ways that wildlife biologists have only recently begun to document. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the predation landscape that Rocky Mountain mule deer are navigating, and you need to understand it with the specificity that the deer themselves appear to be applying to it. Mountain lions are the primary predator of mule deer across most of their range. The statistical relationship between mountain lion density and mule deer population dynamics has been documented across dozens of study systems over multiple decades, and it is robust. In areas with high mountain lion densities and limited alternative prey, mountain lions can suppress mule deer populations below the levels that habitat productivity would otherwise support. They kill deer throughout the year, but the pattern of kills is not random across time, space, or individual vulnerability. Mountain lions are selective predators, in the sense that their kills are biased toward certain categories of prey, specifically toward fawns, toward older adults whose physical condition is declining, and toward individuals whose behavioral decisions or physical circumstances have placed them in terrain or situations that make a successful ambush more likely. The ambush element is the critical one for understanding what the deer are responding to. Mountain lions are not pursuit predators. They do not run deer down in open country. They are stalk and ambush specialists that depend on the ability to approach prey undetected to within a very short distance, typically less than 30 feet, before initiating a charge and attempting to secure a killing bite. This predatory strategy is exquisitely effective in the broken, vegetated terrain of the Rocky Mountain foothills and mid-elevation forests that mule deer occupy across much of their range. The same terrain features that provide deer with cover, the rock outcrops, the dense brush, the timber edges, the drainages choked with willows and alder, provide mountain lions with the concealment they need to complete a stalk without detection. The deer's primary defenses against mountain lion predation are vigilance, group size, and terrain selection. They watch for lions. They move in groups that collectively scan more of the environment than a lone individual can. and they use terrain that provides them with lines of sight long enough to detect an approaching lion before it can close to attack range. The third defense, terrain selection, is where the human infrastructure story begins. Mule deer in mountain lion territory are continuously making decisions about where to be and when to be there that reflect an ongoing assessment of their vulnerability to predation. These decisions are not conscious in the way that a chess player calculates moves, but they are not purely reflexive either. They are the product of a nervous system that is continuously processing environmental information about risk and integrating it into behavioral decisions that have been shaped by millions of years of coevolution with large predators. The deer knows, in a functional sense, that rocky draws with heavy brush are dangerous at dawn and dusk because that is where lions hide and when lions hunt. It knows this not because it has reasoned it out, but because the individuals and populations that failed to know it did not survive long enough to reproduce. The knowledge is in the behavioral tendency, in the elevated vigilance near dense cover, in the preference for open ground during low-light periods, in the avoidance of narrow canyon bottoms where escape routes are limited. What researchers are now documenting is that this long-evolved behavioral repertoire for assessing and managing predation risk has been extended, in populations with sufficient exposure to human settlement, to incorporate a genuinely new piece of environmental information. Human activity, specifically the kind of continuous, low-level human presence associated with roads and residential areas, reliably signals the absence of mountain lions. Not because mountain lions are incapable of moving through those areas. They are, and the GPS collar data from lion studies in multiple states confirms that they do move through human-adjacent terrain, sometimes with surprising regularity. But they do not hunt there. The behavioral conditions that mountain lion predatory behavior requires, the concealment, the silence, the absence of unpredictable human movement and noise and scent, are not available in a residential neighborhood at 7 in the morning or on a county road with regular vehicle traffic. The lions move through. They do not set up the prolonged, patient, concealed approach that their hunting method requires. The deer, it appears, have learned this distinction. They have learned that the human corridor is a place where the predator does not effectively hunt, even if it occasionally passes through, and they have learned to use that characteristic strategically. The research that has most rigorously documented this behavior comes out of a collaboration between researchers at the University of Wyoming, Colorado State University, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department that has been running GPS collar studies on mule deer in the Colorado Rockies and Wyoming's Red Desert and Bighorn Basin country since the mid-2000s. The scale of the data these studies have accumulated is, by the standards of wildlife ecology, extraordinary. Thousands of individual deer tracked across millions of location fixes, covering terrain that ranges from heavily human-modified valley bottoms to remote high-elevation summer ranges, where human presence is essentially absent. The analytical task of extracting meaningful behavioral signal from that volume of data required methodological advances that the research teams developed specifically for this problem, including novel approaches to characterizing the temporal and spatial structure of predation risk across the landscape and relating it to the fine-scale movement decisions of individual deer. What emerged from that analysis was a picture that contradicted the prevailing assumption that human development in mule deer habitat is simply a source of cost, a force that reduces habitat quality and fragments the landscape into pieces that are harder for deer to use. In the populations with the longest exposure to human settlement and the most detailed behavioral data, the deer were demonstrating a pattern of habitat selection during high-risk periods. Specifically, at dawn and dusk in winter and spring when mountain lion predation rates are elevated, that could not be explained by food availability, thermal cover, snow depth, or any of the other standard predictor variables in the classical model. The pattern pointed toward something else, and when the researchers integrated mountain lion activity data from simultaneously running lion studies in the same landscapes, the something else became legible. The deer were moving toward humans when the lions were active. They were using the human corridor as a refuge from the predator, and the refuge was working. Deer that spent more time in close proximity to roads and residential areas during high-risk periods had lower rates of lion predation than deer that did not, controlling for the individual characteristics that independently predict predation vulnerability. The mechanism appears to involve at least 3 distinct components, each of which has been documented with varying degrees of rigor in the literature, and each of which contributes independently to the survival benefit that the human corridor provides. The first is the direct deterrent effect of human activity on mountain lion hunting behavior. Lions in areas with high human traffic move through those areas but do not linger in the way that predatory behavior requires. The evidence for this comes from detailed analysis of GPS collar data from mountain lions in landscapes with variable human activity density, showing that lions spend less time stationary in high human traffic areas, make fewer kills there, and exhibit the prolonged stationary periods almost exclusively in terrain away from roads and residential areas. The deer that position themselves near roads during crepuscular periods are positioning themselves in the parts of the landscape where the probability of being subjected to a sustained lion stalk is lowest. The second component is indirect and involves a kind of information amplification that the human corridor provides. Roads and residential areas generate noise, movement, and scent that disrupt the sensory environment on which both predator and prey depend, for different reasons. Mountain lions rely on their ability to approach prey silently and from downwind. The ambient noise and complex scent environment of a road or residential area degrades their ability to stalk effectively. Deer, on the other hand, can use the enhanced detection opportunity that comes from the open sightlines and noise-dampening contrast that road corridors provide. A deer standing in a road or at the edge of a yard has better visibility of its surroundings than a deer in dense vegetation, and any mountain lion approaching would have to cross open, exposed terrain where the deer's detection ability is enhanced and the lion's concealment options are reduced. The road and yard provide the deer with the landscape asymmetry that favors detection over concealment, which is exactly what the deer's predator defense system requires. The third component is the subtlest and the most behaviorally interesting. Researchers tracking individual deer have documented what appears to be a learned, rather than purely instinctive, aspect of the road use behavior. Fawns whose mothers used road corridors as predator refuges during their early life show a significantly higher rate of road corridor use as adults than fawns from mothers that did not use this strategy. The behavioral transmission appears to occur through the social learning mechanism that deer employ for a variety of complex navigational and risk assessment behaviors. Specifically, through the mother-offspring relationship during the period when fawns are learning to navigate their home range. Fawns follow their mothers. They learn from their mother's movements where water is, where feeding areas are, which terrain features to avoid, and which to seek during specific conditions. If the mother has learned to use road corridors as predator refuges, the fawn learns that lesson alongside every other piece of landscape-specific knowledge that its mother transmits. The behavioral innovation, if that is what it is, can spread through a population, through this transmission mechanism, without requiring that every individual discover it independently. The cultural transmission element of this finding is the one that has generated the most scientific discussion and the most resistance, because it implies a level of behavioral flexibility and social learning sophistication in mule deer that the field has not historically attributed to the species. Mule deer are not, in the standard characterization, considered to be animals with particularly complex social learning systems. They are not wolves, with their well-documented traditions of pack-specific hunting strategies. They are not elephants, with their multi-generational memory of water sources and migration routes encoded in the behavior of matriarchs. They are deer, and the common cultural assumption about deer is that they are driven primarily by instinct and conditioned reflexes, rather than by learned, flexible, culturally transmitted behavioral strategies. The research emerging from the GPS collar studies is complicating that assumption in ways that the field is still working through. The evidence for cultural transmission of the road use behavior is not yet definitive. The studies that have examined the mother-offspring correlation in road use have done so with sample sizes that are large enough to show the correlation clearly, but not large enough, in the view of some researchers, to rule out alternative explanations. It is possible, for example, that the correlation reflects shared home range use rather than genuine behavioral transmission, that mothers and offspring use the same roads because they occupy overlapping space, rather than because the offspring have learned the behavior from the mother. The studies that have tried to distinguish between these explanations using spatial analysis have found results that favor the transmission interpretation over the shared space interpretation. But the debate has not fully resolved. What is not in debate is the population-level pattern. Deer populations in landscapes with longer histories of human settlement show higher rates of road corridor use as predator refuges than deer populations in recently developed areas, which is exactly what would be expected if the behavior spreads through cultural transmission over time rather than emerging immediately wherever the ecological conditions support it. The geographical variation in the behavior is one of the most informative aspects of the research findings, because it shows the behavior embedded in a population-level trajectory rather than appearing as a static characteristic of mule deer as a species. In landscapes where human development has been present for decades, where the current generation of deer is separated from the first generation to encounter suburban sprawl by multiple generations of intervening animals, the road use behavior is widespread, consistent across individuals and seasons, and demonstrably integrated into the population's predator avoidance strategy in a systematic way. In landscapes where human development is recent, where subdivision construction on agricultural land or timber-harvested terrain has occurred within the last 10 or 15 years, the behavior is present but patchy. Some individuals show it strongly, others do not show it at all. The population looks, in the GPS data, like one in transition, like a behavioral innovation that has not yet fully propagated through the social network that transmits these kinds of learned strategies. This geographical gradient tells researchers something important about the timescale on which behavioral adaptation in wild ungulate populations can occur. The standard framework in evolutionary biology distinguishes between genetic adaptation, which requires selection across many generations, and thus operates on timescales of centuries to millennia, and behavioral flexibility, which can express itself within a single individual's lifetime in response to novel conditions. The road use behavior in mule deer appears to fall into a category that occupies the space between these two timescales, something faster than genetic adaptation, but with a propagation dynamic that involves population-level processes rather than purely individual learning. It is spreading through the population at a rate that reflects the social transmission mechanisms available to the species, and it is doing so on a timescale of decades rather than centuries or individual lifetimes. This is a rate of behavioral change that has implications for how conservationists and wildlife managers think about the capacity of prey populations to respond to rapidly changing predator-prey landscapes. The implication is not entirely comfortable. If mule deer can restructure their landscape use in response to the human presence rapidly enough to track the expansion of human development into their range, that capacity for rapid behavioral adaptation might be allowing the species to buffer some of the ecological costs of development in ways that wildlife managers have not accounted for. The standard assessment of residential development in mule deer habitat treats it as straightforwardly negative, fragmenting the landscape, reducing the area of usable habitat, increasing vehicle mortality, degrading migration corridors. All of those costs are real and are documented in the mortality and movement data from multiple studies. But the same data also shows, in populations where the predator refuge behavior has developed, a survival benefit that partially offsets some of those costs during specific high-risk periods. The deer are not benefiting from development in the net sense. The net effect of residential encroachment on mule deer populations across the West is negative, and clearly so. But they are finding and exploiting a specific feature of the developed landscape, the lion-free corridor, in a way that their behavioral framework allows them to take advantage of, even as the broader landscape change works against them. The interaction between this predator refuge behavior and vehicle mortality is one of the most practically consequential aspects of the research, and one that has received surprisingly little systematic treatment in the literature. The problem is straightforward and somewhat grim. Deer that have learned to use roads as predator refuges are spending more time on or near roads than deer that have not. Time spent near roads is time spent in proximity to vehicle traffic. Vehicles kill a great many mule deer. In Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, vehicle collisions with deer result in thousands of documented deer deaths annually, with estimates of true mortality substantially higher when accounting for animals that are struck but not immediately killed and die out of sight of the road. The deer that are using roads most intensively as predator refuges, the animals that have most fully incorporated the human corridor into their predator avoidance strategy, are also disproportionately exposed to the most significant non-predator source of mortality in their landscape. The researchers who have examined this trade-off directly have found that the net survival effect of road corridor use varies by population context in ways that are not fully predictable from first principles. In areas where vehicle traffic on the relevant roads is low or seasonally restricted, the predator refuge benefit appears to substantially outweigh the vehicle mortality cost, and deer that use the roads more intensively have higher overall survival rates than those that do not. In areas with heavy, continuous vehicle traffic, the calculation shifts. The lion deterrence benefit is still present, but the vehicle mortality risk may be high enough that the overall survival arithmetic does not favor intensive road use. The deer in heavily trafficked corridors that show the strongest road use behavior may be making a behavioral error, in the sense of applying a learned strategy in a context where the original cost-benefit calculation no longer holds, because the traffic density has increased beyond the levels under which the behavior was learned and transmitted. This is a form of what behavioral ecologists call an ecological trap, a situation in which a behavioral tendency that was adaptive in the historical conditions of its development becomes maladaptive in altered conditions, but persists because the learning or transmission system that would normally correct it operates too slowly to track the environmental change. Ecological traps are documented in a range of species, and they are particularly common in situations where human modification of the landscape has altered the ecological relationships that a species' behavior has been calibrated to. The mule deer road use behavior may, in some high-traffic contexts, be transitioning from an adaptive strategy into an ecological trap, with the animal's conditioned preference for the human corridor driving them into a source of mortality that their behavioral system has not yet learned to factor appropriately into its risk assessment. The detection problem here is significant. The deer that die on roads leave carcasses that are visible and counted, at least in part. The deer that survive predation because they used roads as refuges are invisible in the mortality data. The benefit is hard to see. The cost is easy to see. Wildlife managers looking at road mortality data without the context of the GPS studies might reasonably conclude that deer road use is simply a problem to be managed, a behavioral tendency that generates casualties and needs to be reduced through fencing, wildlife crossings, or speed reduction measures. That is not a wrong conclusion. It is an incomplete one. The road use behavior is not simply a failure of anti-vehicle behavior by animals that have not learned to avoid traffic. It is a sophisticated predator avoidance strategy that has collateral costs, and the management response that reduces those costs by reducing road access for deer without providing an alternative predation refuge is likely to increase predation mortality while decreasing vehicle mortality, potentially with a net outcome that is worse for the population than the status quo. The research findings have direct implications for how wildlife crossings, which are the primary management tool for reducing vehicle mortality and maintaining landscape connectivity for large mammals, should be designed and placed. The conventional approach to wildlife crossing placement prioritizes corridors of historical movement, areas where GPS data and road mortality records indicate that animals are crossing regularly and generating high collision rates. The predator refuge research suggests that this approach, while not wrong, is missing an important element of the picture. Deer are not just crossing roads, they are using road corridors as linear habitat features with specific functional properties. A wildlife crossing that allows deer to move safely beneath a high-traffic road section is valuable. But if the crossing is designed only with passage function in mind, and not with the predator refuge function of the road corridor in mind, it may route deer away from the human activity zone that was providing them with lion deterrence, and into adjacent terrain where that deterrence is absent. Some of the researchers working on this problem have begun advocating for what they describe as predator-mediated landscape design in human-modified mule deer habitat, an approach that explicitly incorporates the predation risk landscape into decisions about road placement, crossing design, fencing, and residential development patterns. The basic idea is that the configuration of human infrastructure in mule deer habitat matters not just for its connectivity effects, meaning whether it allows deer to move across the landscape, but for its functional effects on the predation risk environment, meaning whether its placement creates or destroys the lion deterrence zones that some populations have learned to exploit. A development pattern that places residential housing and access roads in the valley bottoms and mid-slope terrain, where mule deer experience their highest predation risk, while leaving upper slope and ridge terrain undeveloped, may actually provide a net predation risk reduction benefit that partially offsets its connectivity and habitat fragmentation costs. A development pattern that places housing in the open upper slope terrain, where deer historically sought refuge from ambush predators, while leaving the brushy valley bottoms in a more natural state, might do the opposite. The spatial logic of development matters for deer survival in ways that the current planning framework does not systematically account for. The population-level consequences of the predator refuge behavior and of the management decisions that affect it are playing out against a backdrop of mule deer population dynamics that has been a source of significant concern in wildlife management circles for the past 2 decades. Mule deer populations across much of the Rocky Mountain West declined substantially between the late 1990s and the mid-2010s, with some populations dropping by more than half from their historical highs. The causes of that decline are multiple and interacting, involving changes in habitat quality driven by altered fire regimes and land use, weather patterns associated with drought and deep snow years, hunting pressure, vehicle mortality, predation from multiple species, including coyotes, as well as mountain lions, and disease. Wildlife managers have been working to identify which of these factors dominates in specific populations, and what interventions might reverse or arrest the declines. The predator refuge research adds a new variable to this already complex picture. If the ability of a population to use human infrastructure as a predator refuge is a meaningful contributor to survival rates during high-risk periods, then the spatial relationship between where a given population lives and where human infrastructure is located becomes a variable in the population dynamics equation. Populations that have access to road and residential corridors and that have the behavioral history necessary to have developed the refuge-seeking behavior may be experiencing lower predation mortality than populations that do not, independently of the other factors that drive population change. This is a testable prediction, and some of the research teams working in this area are currently collecting the data needed to evaluate it. Early results suggest that the prediction has merit, that populations with the strongest road use behavior in the GPS data show predation mortality rates somewhat lower than would be predicted from mountain lion density and deer density alone. But the sample sizes are not yet large enough to draw firm conclusions, and the other factors driving mortality variation between populations are difficult enough to control for that the statistical power required to isolate the predator refuge effect is substantial. The research has also raised questions about the relationship between the predator refuge behavior and mule deer social structure, specifically about how the behavior interacts with the species' characteristic seasonal shifts in group size and composition. Mule deer are not year-round social animals in the way that elk or bison are. Females and young form loose maternal groups during the summer fawning period, come together in larger mixed groups during the fall rut, and then winter in sex-segregated herds in which group size varies dramatically with habitat and population density. The GPS data from the road use studies shows that the predator refuge behavior is not uniformly distributed across these social contexts. It is most strongly expressed in winter, when the deer are in larger groups and when mountain lion predation rates are seasonally elevated. It is least strongly expressed during the summer period, when does with fawns are in small, dispersed groups in high-elevation terrain that may not include road corridors. This seasonal pattern in the behavior makes ecological sense when viewed through the lens of the predation risk calendar. Mountain lions kill mule deer throughout the year, but their kill rates are highest in winter and spring. Several factors contribute to this seasonality. Snow conditions that restrict deer movement while not significantly hindering lion movement can create periods of elevated vulnerability. Deer that have moved to lower elevation winter range are often in closer proximity to mountain lion home ranges that are centered in the mid-elevation foothills and canyon systems. Deer body condition is lowest in late winter, and compromised condition reduces the vigor of the escape response. Fawns born the previous summer are approaching their first winter in a vulnerable size and experience class. All of these factors combine to make the November through March period the window of highest predation risk for most mule deer populations in the Rockies. The strongest expression of the road use behavior in winter is exactly what would be expected if the behavior is functioning as a predation risk management strategy rather than as a response to some other seasonal variable like food availability or thermal cover. The interaction between the predator refuge behavior and fawn survival deserves particular attention because fawn survival is the demographic variable with the largest influence on mule deer population growth rates. In most mule deer populations, The principal source of variance in population trajectory from year to year is not adult survival, but fawn survival, through the first winter. When fawn survival is high, populations grow. When it is low, populations decline. The factors that drive fawn survival are multiple, including maternal nutrition, weather, disease, and predation from coyotes, as well as mountain lions. But predation is among the most important in many systems. If does with fawns are using road corridors as predator refuges during the periods when fawn predation risk is highest, and if that use results in measurably lower fawn predation rates, then the predator refuge behavior may be having demographic effects that ripple through to population growth rates in ways that have been invisible in the standard population model framework because the mechanism was unknown. The research does not yet have enough longitudinal data to definitively link individual-level predator refuge behavior to population-level demographic outcomes in a causal sense. That linkage requires years of paired data on individual deer behavior and fawn survival outcomes from mothers with different behavioral profiles. Data that the ongoing GPS studies are accumulating but have not yet accumulated in sufficient quantity to close the argument. The theoretical pathway from individual survival benefit to population demographic effect is clear enough that several research groups have built it into their predictive models. Whether the empirical data will confirm the modeled relationship at the scale and magnitude the models predict is a question that the next 5 to 10 years of data collection should begin to answer. The mountain lion side of this equation is not static, which is perhaps the most important and least appreciated aspect of the entire research picture. Mountain lions are not passive elements in the landscape that occupy fixed territories and hunt in fixed ways, regardless of how their prey changes its behavior. They are intelligent, flexible predators with demonstrated capacities for learning and behavioral adjustment. The question of whether mountain lions are responding to the shift in mule deer behavior, whether they are adjusting their own movement and hunting strategies to account for the fact that deer are spending more time in human-adjacent terrain, is one that several research teams are actively examining. The preliminary findings are not reassuring if your primary interest is in keeping the lion deterrence effect of the human corridor intact. In some of the study systems where mule deer road use has been documented for the longest time, there is evidence that mountain lions have begun to modify their own hunting behavior in ways that may be reducing the effectiveness of the predator refuge. Lions in these areas are showing a somewhat higher tolerance for proximity to human infrastructure during their hunting movements than is characteristic of the species in less human-modified terrain. They are not hunting in residential yards or on active roadways, but they are initiating hunts from positions closer to the road edge, and they are making kills in terrain that is closer to road corridors than the distribution of their kills in earlier datasets would have predicted. The margin of safety that the road corridor was providing, the buffer zone of lion avoidance that the deer were exploiting, appears to be somewhat narrower in these populations than it was when the road use behavior first emerged. This is the kind of evolutionary dynamic that ecologists describe as a co-evolutionary arms race, a back-and-forth adjustment in predator and prey behavior in which each party's behavioral adaptation creates selective pressure for a counter-adaptation in the other party. The deer's use of roads as predator refuges creates selective pressure on mountain lions to become more tolerant of human infrastructure during hunting behavior, because the lions that can hunt closer to roads have access to a prey distribution that increasingly clusters there. If lions with higher human proximity tolerance during hunting pass that behavioral tendency to their offspring, the prey's refuge becomes less effective over time. The prey then faces selective pressure to find new or modified strategies for reducing predation risk. Whether this dynamic is actually operating in the study populations or whether the apparent shift in lion behavior near roads reflects individual learning by specific animals rather than a population-level behavioral trend, is something that the current data cannot definitively distinguish. But the possibility is real, and it is the kind of long-term ecological dynamic that happens on timescales longer than most research projects, but shorter than the timescales on which genetic evolution operates. There is a management dimension to this co-evolutionary question that has practical urgency. One of the ways that wildlife managers in some jurisdictions have tried to reduce deer-vehicle collisions is by installing fencing that channels deer movements away from high-traffic road sections and toward wildlife crossings. The fencing, when it is properly designed and maintained, is effective at reducing collision mortality. But it also, by definition, reduces deer access to the road corridor that some populations have been using as a predator refuge. A deer that is channeled by fencing away from the roadside and through a vegetated crossing underpass has been moved from the human activity zone that deters lion hunting into a vegetated corridor where the lion's stalking conditions are substantially better. There are documented cases in the literature of mountain lion activity concentrating near the approaches to wildlife crossing structures, where deer movement is predictable and funneled, which creates the kind of ambush conditions that lions are specialized to exploit. The implications for crossing design are direct. A crossing that is designed purely for deer passage without incorporating the predator ecology of the approach corridor may inadvertently create a predation hotspot by concentrating deer in a predictable location with terrain conditions favorable to ambush. Crossings that have been designed with this consideration in mind, using open, wide approach geometry rather than narrow vegetated tunnels, and placing them in locations where ambient human activity is sufficient to maintain some deterrent effect on lion hunting behavior, appear in the preliminary assessment of the available data to perform better on the combined metric of collision reduction and predation mortality. But the evidence base for this specific design principle is thin, and the engineering and ecological communities that design wildlife crossings have been slow to integrate the predation risk landscape into their design criteria. The broader conservation framing of this research is one that deserves explicit attention, because the findings are being interpreted in different ways by different stakeholders, and some of those interpretations are drawing conclusions that the research does not support. The fact that mule deer in some populations have developed a behavioral strategy for using human infrastructure as a predator refuge does not mean that human development in mule deer habitat is neutral or beneficial. It does not mean that the fragmentation effects of road building and residential expansion are offset by the predation deterrence effects of the human presence. The research is very clear that the net effect of development on mule deer populations is negative at the landscape scale. What the research shows is that within that net negative picture, deer are finding and exploiting a specific functional benefit of the human corridor, the suppression of mountain lion hunting activity, in a way that partially offsets predation mortality at the individual and local population level. Exploiting a resource that exists as a byproduct of a damaging process is not the same as being unharmed by the process. The deer are making the best of a bad situation with an adaptability that is genuinely impressive. That adaptability does not transform the bad situation into a good one. The research also does not support the interpretation that wildlife managers should deliberately increase human infrastructure in mule deer habitat as a predation management strategy. That would be a misapplication of the findings that would sacrifice the habitat quality and landscape connectivity that mule deer populations ultimately depend on in exchange for a localized and fragile predation risk reduction whose long-term effectiveness depends on mountain lions not adapting their behavior in the ways the co-evolutionary evidence suggests they may already be doing in some areas. The appropriate management response to these findings is not to build more roads in deer habitat. It is to design the roads, crossings, fencing, and residential development patterns that already exist and that are going to continue to exist, regardless of what wildlife managers prefer, in ways that account for the full functional ecology of how deer are using the human-modified landscape. That means incorporating predation risk into crossing design. It means considering the spatial relationship between human activity zones and high-risk terrain when making decisions about where development is permitted. It means treating the predator refuge function of some road corridors as a management value that should be weighed against the collision mortality cost rather than ignored. The communities at the edge of mule deer habitat, the towns and subdivisions in the Colorado Rockies and the Wyoming basins and the mountain valleys of Utah and Montana, where residential development has been expanding most rapidly into historical mule deer range, have a specific and practical stake in this research that is worth making explicit. The deer that are using residential yards as predator refuges are not exotic visitors. In many of these communities, they are a permanent and daily presence that residents have developed strong opinions about in both directions. Some residents actively feed them, maintain landscaping that provides browse, and consider the deer a valued part of the neighborhood ecology. Others resent the landscaping damage, the collision risk on local roads, and the attraction that the deer bring to mountain lions, which occasionally follow deer into yards with outcomes that are disturbing and occasionally dangerous. Both of these resident perspectives are responses to the same phenomenon, which is that the deer have incorporated the residential area into their functional landscape as a survival resource, and the community has to manage the consequences. The management options available to residential communities include fencing, landscaping with deer-resistant plants, reducing supplemental feeding, and supporting wildlife management policies that address mountain lion presence near residential areas. What is not currently available to most communities is a management framework that accounts for the predator refuge function of the residential area in a systematic way that treats the deer's use of the yard as something more than a nuisance to be managed, and recognizes it as a behavior with ecological logic that has implications for how the community's relationship to wildlife should be structured. The research on mule deer road use and predator refuge behavior is not a complete story. It is a story in progress, one that is generating hypotheses faster than the available data can test them, and raising management questions faster than the wildlife management community can develop answers. The studies that have produced the most compelling evidence are ongoing, and the analytical frameworks being developed to interpret that evidence are still being refined. Several important questions remain genuinely open. The relative importance of individual learning versus social transmission in spreading the behavior through populations is not fully resolved. The long-term trajectory of the co-evolutionary dynamic between deer road use and mountain lion hunting behavior near infrastructure is unknown. The demographic magnitude of the effect of predator refuge behavior on fawn survival and population growth rates has not been quantified with the precision needed for management application. The optimal design principles for wildlife crossings that account for the predation risk landscape have not been empirically validated at multiple sites. What is resolved, firmly enough to be stated without qualification, is the core behavioral finding. Rocky Mountain mule deer, in populations with sufficient exposure to human settlement and sufficient time for the behavior to develop and spread, are using roads, residential yards, and human corridors as functional predator refuges during high-risk periods. They are doing this in a way that confers a measurable individual survival benefit. They appear to be transmitting the behavior through social networks in ways that allow it to spread through populations over decades. The behavior represents a behavioral adaptation to the human-modified landscape that is more sophisticated, more ecologically functional, and more strategically complex than the standard framework for understanding prey animal behavior in human-dominated terrain had allowed for. And it has implications for wildlife management, infrastructure design, residential planning, and the conservation of both mule deer and the mountain lion predator that is driving the behavior, that the management community is only beginning to absorb. There is something in this finding that, when you sit with it long enough, fundamentally changes how you think about the deer you see standing in a subdivision at dusk, backlit by garage lights, apparently browsing on ornamental shrubs with the kind of serene indifference to the surrounding built environment that always seems vaguely incongruous. That deer is not there primarily because the shrubs are good. It is not.